Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to this gathering in celebration and in honor of the life of our dear friend and colleague, Miriam Hansen.
I first met Miriam shortly after she came to the university in the early 1990s. It was, as many of you remember, a time of considerable complexity for the university, which in fact formed the backdrop for the early conversations that she and I had. And what I appreciated so much about talking to Miriam as I got to know her was the wonderful complexity of thought and action that she always seemed to demonstrate. And to me, she was a passionate defender of long-standing values, but was likewise a passionate advocate for evolution and change. And this, of course, is very implicit in the nature of her own scholarly work. She approached everything with nuance, but with a clear ability to come to a conclusion and be a forceful advocate. In true Chicago tradition, she and I often agreed, but not always. But I always sought her out and continued to seek her out, really, until the end. For I always learned a great deal from her, understanding about how she would think about various issues. And while our early conversations began around the university, they naturally grew more personal over the years, and we talked a good deal about many, many things, including her struggles with cancer. It's, of course, a very sad truth that one learns a great deal about a person while they're dealing with adversity. And Miriam simply amazed me. And I use that word not as hyperbole, because hyperbole is easy, but in fact she really did amaze me. Because the same combination of nuance, values, action, and determination that she exhibited in her scholarly work and her thinking about the university as a whole, she demonstrated in incorporating a struggle with cancer into the whole of her life. And I said as much to Miriam at one point, just how much she was amazing me at how she was dealing with everything. And she smiled in appreciation at this, but I also saw that she was hearing even that with the complexity with which she heard everything. In 2002, when I left for Brown for 4 years, I said goodbye to many people. But saying goodbye to Miriam at that time had a special but unspoken poignancy to it, for both she and I knew that this goodbye might have a very different meaning than some of the other goodbyes I was saying at the time. And of course, I was so happy to see her on my return to Chicago in 2006. We'd been in touch, but really hadn't seen each other. And to see that while she continued to have the ups and downs of struggling with cancer, that she retained every bit of the grace, balance, and vitality that I had always appreciated about her. Though not the final time that I spoke to her, one of the last times I spoke to her was part of a continuing conversation about something that I had asked if she might undertake for the university in the future. And as usual, she was totally forthright about looking forward to it, wanting to do it, yet knowing that it might not happen. And I will always remember Miriam for her intensity and her grace and her forcefulness and balance. Her absence is a great loss for the university, and like so many of us, I miss her today and will continue to miss her.
I speak here to you as one of Miriam's European friends from her German time and our shared times as students. Miriam and I were both born in 1949 and only a month apart. The world we were born to was deeply marked by the then recent history. Our playgrounds were the rubble fields and the streets and the extended woods between Frankfurt, where I grew up, and Darmstadt, where Miriam grew up, some 25 miles apart. There we played Indians and cowboys, outlaw and sheriff, and so on. And Miriam became even a member of the German Boy Scouts groups, the Pfadfinder, the Pathfinder in German, and she was pretty good in it, as always, while I have known the Boy Scouts only from the activities of the 3 nephews of Donald Duck. That was a shared empathy we had for the early Donald Duck cartoons. I guess that being a child in the 50s was like this. We met much later as students at the Frankfurt University, where we started with the outbreak of the student revolt and took part in it, in sit-ins against the reactionary emergency laws and more international issues like the Vietnam War, etc. We both were joining the courses of Adorno and were deeply influenced by the Frankfurt School, whose first generation we encountered just before they passed away. We shared the passion for film and were the core of a small group of pioneers that tried to develop something like film studies in an academic milieu that was not at all embracing anything linked to popular culture. To combine Adorno and film theory remained a lifelong enterprise that Miriam finally accomplished with a book that will be published posthumously and be her legacy to all of us, giving us future hope to furthermore being engaged with her in her words. Miriam was a person who took her life in her own hands. She had a strong will and very precise ideas about what she wanted and how to go there. And even if it took sometimes time, she managed to finish this unfinished business against all odds. But the secret of her strong will was not entirely normative, even if she showed an enormous level of self-discipline. The strength of her will was driven by a powerful élan vital that connected her intensively to life in all its mental and somatic fibers. As fragile as her physiology seemed to be, her appearance was vibrant and radiant, animated by this untamed wish to live that was incorporated in her, and animating and vitalizing nearly everybody who came near to her, friends, colleagues, students. That's how I will have her stay in my memory. Memories of Miriam are for me almost always animated sound pictures, a way to move, to raise eyebrows and tone, to smile ironically and sardonically while unleashing a rather sharp remark on nearby everything made remarkable. A flow of words and jokes in never-ending conversations. I remember her nervously hopping between the local and the express train and the New Yorker subway system, the rapid and solid grip on equally strange and attractive objects on flea markets and second-hand shops we used to cruise in our youthful days. Some objects can still be seen. To synchronize with Miriam was the experience of being in the same time with her, to share a temporal spatial present. I remember us forming a street corner society of words while we were students at the Frankfurt University. Whenever we meet accidentally around the campus, we would engage in a conversation about her dissertation on Ezra Pound, the latest Alexander Kluge film, politics, feminism, and what else popped up among girls. This was the fabric from which our friendship was tailored, a spontaneous wish to communicate and to share experiences. When she had brilliantly accomplished her dissertation and left for Yale, our friendship continued via letters, calls, postcards from all over the world, extensive visits, and shared academic and intellectual projects. It came with the Atlantic divide that the spontaneous synchronization between the two Frankfurt girls was slowly transformed in a different shape. With the spatial distance to her family origins grew the insight of what they were about. Spontaneous synchronization, being at the pulse of time, gave way to the acknowledgement of contemporaneity. Because being a contemporary means much more than just to live in a shared time slot. Contemporaneity entails consciousness about the time in which one is living. Contemporaneity means to look at the present in terms of the future. How will the time have been we have lived in? Contemporaneity has an historical index into the future and equally implies the link into the past. When Miriam took her life in her hands and came to this country, it was not just a spontaneous idea, a good offer from Yale. It was a contemporary answer to her parents' return to Germany from the British exile. Miriam explained to me very often that she understood her act as a willing act of immigration. She thought that her parents did a wrong move to come back to Germany and to raise their children in distance to the Jewish origin of her mother, who survived in a children's transport from her native Prague to England. It was around this decision that Miriam synchronized herself with her past. To understand this existential decision needs to understand how the Jewish life in post-war Germany was. Born in 1949, few weeks before the Bundesrepublik was founded, means to be deeply rooted in the devastating past of the first half of the 20th century, and at the same time being exposed as living symbol for a possible something more than just surviving, a new beginning, the start of the future, finally for this generation. The parental delegation to live a life that represents no longer the past but the future formed to the complex with which Miriam and many other children of the so-called second generation had to struggle. And our friendship had its deep ground in this shared sensorium that developed from there. In many ways, the double structure, to live inside of the family with all the scars and open wounds and craziness the Holocaust has left on its survivors, and to live outside the family the imaginary, normal life of optimistic involvement in the Wirtschaftswunder, the Wiederaufbau, etc., was broken by the decision to emigrate to the US. And it is here where Miriam became a contemporary of post-war Germany in the full sense of the word. Jewish life in Germany continued to be double life, a life torn between two poles. The characteristic of the German Jews having a dual identity, that's the title of Paul Mendes-Flohr's impressive book on the subject. But after 45, the doubledness were tinted with paradox and paranoia, and meanwhile novels, films, and studies tried to picture alive what Miriam finally fled. The mother were very active in reconstructing a Jewish community in Darmstadt and involved Miriam in those activities like the WISO, the Women in Zionism, who collected for Israel, organized travels, and so on. But at the same time, Miriam was baptized, and with this act of unwanted and unrequested conversion was held at a distance to her own Jewishness. To keep this in balance is not easy, and Miriam often complained to me that she felt very uneasy and unhappy with this confusing state of being. The doubledness of Jewish life in post-war Germany had much more reasons. The Jewish communities were mostly built on survivors who were far from the reform movements and panically encapsulated themselves in strict Orthodox rules. The few and often mixed children from German Jews, whose parents rarely came back from their sites of emigration, had no place to go inside of Germany, and so Miriam decided to go, not back but forward. I remember that it was a great relief to feel accepted in the US along the famous formula by Gustav Landauer. I quote him: "I never had the need to simplify myself, or to create an artificial unity through denial. I accept my complexity and hope to be even more many-sided than I am now aware of it." The famous formula of Gustav Landauer, given in 1913, very slowly penetrates the German horizon of the 21st century. Miriam opened this horizon already in the 70s of the last century and lived to it. A courageous life, a life that stands for contemporaneity, and in this she will be with us for a much longer time span than her physical life lasted. She moves us in her death as much as she did in her life, and she will survive in our memories as long as we live.
Men must endure their going hence, even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. In the epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh reaches the shores of the oceans of death, in his quest for immortality, he is met by a goddess. And the goddess tells him, "O Gilgamesh, what you seek will never be found. For when the gods created mankind, immortality they kept for themselves, and death they dispensed to humankind." End of quotation. Along with this dispensation of mortality came a blessing. The hour of our appointment with death remains unknown. But what goes through the hearts and minds of those who can hear the approaching steps of death? From the moment this sentence is passed, they hold dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. They confront their challenges with astonishing courage while negotiating the enormity of isolation. And some of us have the privilege to interact with such exceptional souls on a daily basis, to witness firsthand the remarkable dignity with which they face their ongoing ordeals. Theirs are the heroic stories of hardiness, of ingenuity, of resourcefulness. While other tributes celebrate and will celebrate Miriam's exceptional life and her achievements, I had the unique honor of witnessing the grace with which she endured the repeated sentences of death for more than a decade. Miriam fought not one, but 4 cancers, ferociously, intensely, obsessively, and compulsively, applying the rigor and diligence of her quintessential academic background to unpack the disorienting details of the often conflicting advice she got from her various oncologists. Such an exercise, continuing for years on end, would drain any normal individual of colossal amounts of psychic energy, but not Miriam, who until the very end epitomized to perfection what my dear friend Edward Said so eloquently calls the aesthetic of poise. Indeed, Miriam faced each escalating ordeal with astounding composure. Whenever we were together or talked on the phone, the joyous anarchy of her marvelous energy dispelled any aura of gloom. How deeply humbled I felt when during our last phone conversation, the day before she died, at a time when she could barely complete sentences because of the severe shortness of breath. Once our medical conversation was over, she asked about my daughter's college admission news before hanging up. If by ripeness is all Shakespeare meant that humans must do what they honorably can do to keep themselves alive until the hour comes, then let me state categorically that my friend Miriam, through the nobility with which she endured her trials, more than achieved this ripeness. Finally, I I want to pay tribute to Miriam and her own personal rock of support, Michael, without whose deep love and constant companionship, Miriam would not have lasted half this long. The manner in which both of them conducted themselves through this long ordeal is what I imagine Shakespeare meant when Antony says to Cleopatra, "Let Rome and Tiber melt, and the wide arc of the ranged empire fall. Here is my space. Kingdoms are clay, are dungy earth, alike feeds beast as man. The nobleness of life is to do thus." Thank you.
June 17th. Dear Bill, I tried to reach you on your cell phone but didn't get through. We'll try again, or you try me. Things have been deteriorating. My counts went into free fall, and I spent all day Friday getting blood transfusions. In the middle of this, I'm happy to be thinking about Krakauer again and find myself changing my mind on his late work. Please, let's make time to talk about that. Much love, Miriam. In those last months, really these last few years, Miriam's project of keeping herself alive and the project of completing her book on cinema and experience seemed inextricable. In an email exchange or an exchange of glances, over the course of a walk, during a meal, in the middle of dinner at the hospital, after ringing the nurse to insist that it was time for her medication, she looked at me and said, "Contingency. What do you think Krakauer means by contingency?" Our intellectual intimacy was at once intense and casual. Casual because we had come to share an archive of insights and convictions, agreements and studied disagreements. When she returned to the classroom after her opening bout with cancer about a decade ago, we taught together. Modernity and the sense of things. 2 lectures a week, plus discussion sections for both graduate and undergraduate students, plus weekly screenings. Imagism and vorticism and Dadaism and precisionism and surrealism, arcades and department stores, Bergson, Lukács, Heidegger, Benjamin, Krakauer, Zola, Chaplin, Vertov, Breton, Virginia Woolf. Mannequins, canes, scarves, umbrellas, shoes. I'd never been so exhausted by a 10-week course as by the summer-long, literally summer-long preparation, as by the phone calls during the course, about the course, what we had done, what we were going to do next. The week it was over, Miriam sidled up to me at a party, looking radiant. She wanted to know just when we should start planning for the next iteration of the course. November 4th. It was great to see you talk in the media business and get your inspirations and changes on the preface. Bad news from the scans. Something has been growing in my liver, which explains the persistent nausea. When I first read a draft of the preface, a little history of film studies, a piece and a serious piece of intellectual autobiography, I was convinced that Miriam should give the piece as a talk. With considerable help, I fashioned a date, December 8th, and an idea, an event for colleagues and friends, students and former students, an opportunity to hear from the book before the book saw print. Pleased though she was to be asked, Miriam couldn't do a talk, she said, until she heard better news from her doctors. I wanted to say, ah shit, Miriam, is there going to be better news? But of course I knew that she felt, that she knew that there might be, there certainly had been. Besides which, the preface behind her, she had her mind on the next project. In the preface we did not hear on December 8th, Miriam confronts the convergence of those questions that had come to shape the second half of her career. On the one hand, how does new technology and its modes of production, distribution, and consumption change our conceptualization of spectatorship, of the mass mediation of publics, and of cinema itself? On the other, what can the study of new media learn from the analytical encounter with cinema and mass culture from the first decades of the 20th century? Without seizing that past on behalf of the future of our present, we simply succumb to the temporality of consumer culture, the law of novelty and obsolescence. Miriam, who was not just her body and not just her book, had a way with old media, such as the picture postcard, loyally sent from Tokyo, from Shanghai, from the south of France, with reports about what she and Michael had seen on their afternoon hike. Miriam was enchanted by new things: a new necklace, black pearls, a new scarf, orange silk with a band of gold, a new fruit stand in Michigan, a new novel by Sarah Paretsky, a new hire. January 14th. The radiation is getting to me. It seems interminable, and my counts are low, and I'm miserable. Whenever you need me for recruiting, let me know. When I last saw her, she was propped up in bed. I sat in a chair beside the bed. Isabella coyly circled and circled as cats do. We spoke about the future of new media at Chicago, and we spoke about Alice in Wonderland, the 3D movie with Johnny Depp, which she'd seen in San Diego with Michael and Leslie and Jeffrey. She was organizing her notes about the movie, eager to write about how it clarifies the way in which cinema has always been an investigation of scale. Chagrined, quite chagrined, that I hadn't in fact seen Alice in Wonderland, she was nonetheless settled by my willingness to share again her sense of how the new, rather than supplanting what's been, can renew it, and my comfort again in her perception of that Spielraum, that room for play, within which to sense how things might be other than they are.
Michael asked me to abridge and assemble 5 encomia that he has received since Miriam's death, mostly from people who could not be here today. 2 are by students and 3 are by colleagues, all by people who held Miriam dear. He hopes that this small gathering of flowers, this florilegium, can stand for the vast garden of affection and esteem that has grown up around Miriam over the years. The first of these was sent from Australia by Paula Ahmad, Associate Professor of Cinema and Comparative Studies at the University of Iowa. I first saw Miriam one cold, snow-blasted day outside the English quadrangle at the University of Chicago campus. I was standing with a group of students commiserating about the weather when a petite woman wearing a huge fur trader type hat came trudging through the snow toward us. I will never forget this apparition, not because of the incongruousness of the huge hat on her small frame, but because she was also sporting an implausibly healthy tan and a cheeky grin, as though she'd arrived from another planet. The tan, she explained, was from Australia, where she had recently visited. The cheeky smile was, of course, Miriam's own creation. Emerging from that freezing landscape with a mysterious glint in her eye, she exuded the warmth and friendliness of my country's faraway sun. I remember thinking to myself, now that is a woman to follow. Today, lying in my parents' backyard under the generous Australian sunshine, I felt Miriam all around me in its warmth. She will continue to be with me in so many ways, obviously as an intellectual inspiration, but more importantly as a caring friend whose concern, compassion, and advice always made me feel at home in a foreign land. The next is from Andreas Heusen, Phillips Professor of German and Comparative Literature at Columbia. I can give you one measure of what he meant to Miriam by reporting my memorable encounter with Miriam on the quad in August of 2000, on her return from receiving dire news at the hospital. Having been told for the first time, though as we've already heard, not for the last, that she might have just weeks to live, she was terribly anxious about how to ensure that her book would be seen into print should she not be able to finish it herself. After serious reflection, she named Andreas Heusen as the scholar to whom she would entrust the unfinished manuscript. Miriam Hansen, writes Heusen, was an inspiration as a fine scholar, intellectual, teacher, and friend. Her writing was a model in that she always pushed against the limitation of that earlier theoretical formulation by historicizing it and then reading it against the grain. She devised strategies to rethink key questions that had been first posed by those German exiles she studied, and to rearticulate them in terms of contemporary culture and politics. Her work on mass media aesthetics in the public sphere, on cinematic Holocaust representations, and on vernacular modernism in global perspective are but examples of this striking ability to work with a tradition and to transform it at the same time. Incredibly open and generous toward friends and intellectual companions, she was a superb listener, but never shy to say where she stood in a debate. Yet when the debate was over, there was this unforgettable twinkling in her eyes and that endearing smile. Personal modesty combined with simple sartorial elegance, upfront honesty with loyalty to people and to ideas, total dedication to her students with a sense of responsibility to the film and media program she has created at the University of Chicago. Miriam will be missed and remembered for many years to come. Now a statement from Harold Bloom, Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale, whom Miriam got to know soon after her arrival at Yale from Frankfurt back in the late 1970s. Miriam was one of my closest friends for more than 30 years. She had qualities so rare and valuable that I scarcely can imagine that our conversations have now concluded. It is very difficult to discuss her intellectual and emotional endowments as if they could be separated from one another. She thought feelingly and expressed her affections through her cognitive apprehension of her friends, her students, and her hopes for the public sphere. I cannot recall a moment in which either her spirit or her compassion faltered. Recollecting the decades in which I was privileged to benefit from her wisdom and keen sense of arts and society is an almost endless process. Without Miriam, I would not have known how to understand the Frankfurt School and its teaching of the kind of Jewish negation that has allowed me better to know Franz Kafka, Gershom Scholem, and Sigmund Freud. It is too soon to stand back from my memories of Miriam and to see her in perspective, but when I think that the meaning of the Judaic blessing is more life, then I always will be reminded of her. She fought so gallantly for her life because she understood that the only wealth is life. Another of Miriam's successful students is Zhen Zhang, Professor of Cinema Studies and East Asian Studies at NYU. And she sent this. The last time I saw Miriam was last Thanksgiving when I was waiting for my plane to go to Frankfurt for a conference. Sitting in front of the gate, I thought for a minute whether it was a good time to call her. I knew she loved the phone, but I also knew she needed to wrap up her book and rest a lot when she was not writing. I keyed her name in the address book. She was there and audibly happy for a call. We chatted a bit, and then she said it was nice to be thinking of me on my way to her home ground. My tears were welling up. Yes, I called in part to let her know that I was in some way reciprocating in a Chinese fashion her visit to Shanghai, my hometown, several years ago after she fell in love with the Chinese cinema. Before hanging up, I said I'd call again before too long, but now regret profoundly that I did not until it was too late. Looking back, I am comforted by that last conversation that she and I had, and knowing that her thoughts were with me on that journey across the Atlantic. I am glad to have visited her home before she departed to her final resting place. And now finally from Leslie Stern, professor in visual arts at the University of California, San Diego, who'd known Miriam since 1980 and who reunited with her when Pam Wojcik brought Miriam to Australia in the early 1990s. Leslie returns us to the snow in which Miriam died. A few weeks before she died, Miriam and I walked in the snow near where she lived in Chicago. She walked this route almost every day of her life, through the Japanese garden, around the small lake, usually with her beloved Michael. It was routine, and yet every time it was new. Every time she discovered new things to delight in, new sensuous pleasures. That day was no exception. It was exhilarating and fun, and we laughed at new leaves and probably emerging on dead twigs, the young men improvising a skating rink on the lake, the sound and touch of the softly drifting snow. We talked of what would happen to her ashes and what we would cook for dinner, anticipating a tussle over the exact timing of the beans, about 3 minutes or 2 minutes and 45 seconds exactly, and of the book Miriam had finished on Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, and Krakauer, how her ideas had changed over the years and how her understandings of aesthetics had mutated. I think now of Walter Benjamin and his collection of snow globes. I wish I could encapsulate that memory in a snow globe, shake it up at will, use it as an antidote to grief. But somehow Miriam won't stay put, fixed in one place, predictably globalized. She has more to say. Her voice continues to whistle and whir through the permeable contours of the snow globe, infiltrating our somatic consciousness, waking us up.
Moments like this, which mark a leave-taking that is unwilled, resisted, painful, and yet undeniable, make us aware of ourselves as a series of encounters, sometimes passing within the closest of margins, sometimes actually colliding. Miriam touched so many in this room and elsewhere in a full range of distances and velocities. First, I want to read one account of encountering Miriam, partly because I don't know who wrote it, and no one has been able to tell me. It shows how broadly the ripples of influence Miriam set in motion reach. It appeared as a blog on the internet, clearly from a former student. Quoting, "Word has trickled out via Facebook from those in a position to know that Miriam Hansen, long of the University of Chicago, has died. This callow young cinetrix was fortunate to take Hansen's grad Intro to Film Studies course in the screening room that served as physical evidence of the program and facilities Hansen built there. She was as intimidating as hell. What I first learned in her classroom years ago, and in her comments and second reader on my MA thesis, manifests itself constantly in my own teaching and thinking about film. Not to mention her sartorial influence. I can't remember which of my classmates first made the observation that Professor Hansen's garb tended to complement that day's films. But it is true that her outfit to teach Johnny guitar, say, echoed somehow the Teflon invincibility of Joan Crawford's white dress and the butchiness of Vienna's otherwise masculine Western wear. Whenever I pause in the morning in front of the closet and consider which movie we'll be discussing before selecting the day's pedagogic drag, I think of Miriam Hansen. I wish I'd had the opportunity to tell her so." End of that quote. Miriam understood the mysteries of appearances, of surfaces, of images, and like many of us, her love of cinema lay in trying to understand how the secrets of moving images could be assessed through words, how these evasive projective patterns of light and sound could generate thought and language, and yet also escape its confines, dash on ahead, and compel thought to try to catch up, to end up somewhere it might not have wandered on its own. I felt that she and I were engaged in a like task, but always at slightly different points in the pursuit, and that we played a long-term game of hide and seek, sometimes catching each other, occasionally losing sight, often colliding, and always pulled on by the other. And now she's gone. As critics, I think we often think our own thoughts through reading others. And I draw, therefore, on another account of a friendship of inspiration interrupted too soon. The filmmaker Hollis Frampton left a description of the work of his friend, the photographer Diane Arbus, after her untimely death. His own death, alas, followed too quickly. Quoting from Frampton, "Diane Arbus has left us images that affirm in ways as various as themselves this doubling and duality and duplicity of our every experience. She made them, as she once found words to say, quote, because they will have been so beautiful," unquote. Now, in this moment, as I see once again the photographs of Diane Arbus, these words that I drop behind me consume themselves as if by fire, evacuating the pathway of my thought as it is drawn to what is before it, namely the images themselves. These images then offer me everything but words. They enclose us apostrophize the exquisite stasis of a tableau vivant, tinted to my disturbance and satisfaction by my own lenses, divided by an impenetrable membrane that is neither quite gauze, nor caul, nor screen, nor window, nor yet mirror, within which or through which or upon which two personifications fix each other in endless regard, in a posture of easy attention, image and word, eros and thanatos, eternity and time, multitudes of partnership, at once open and secret, stare each other and themselves into existence. Diane Arbus and I, more or less in focus, may be among them, because she is gone, but never, to my pleasure, quite entirely absent. And I am here, but never, to my pain, quite entirely present.
I was a student of Miriam's, although that doesn't mark me out, I think, from anybody else. As many people here can attest, it was easy to become Miriam's student. All you had to do was talk to her for a while, get to know her for a bit. Without any effort, she made you want to be her student, to learn from her, to gain new insight, to simply listen to what she had to say, whether about film, culture, politics, or even where to go in Michigan for peaches. She had opinions about all these and more, and held them very strongly. They were opinions one felt that were worth knowing. I can't tell you how much I miss talking to her, and I know I'm not the only one who does. Of course I learned from Miriam. She was the rare person with a genuinely original way of thinking about things, and I was lucky enough to be around her for a number of years. Some of what I learned was intellectual, about how to think about and understand the world around me, and how to think about film in particular. I learned other things too. Something I thought a lot about while she was alive, and more since her death, was a moment when she was first planning to undergo surgery for melanoma. I remember talking to her about this, and her frank acknowledgement that she might not survive the surgery, and of course she did. It came to seem to me, at least, that she might be immortal. A couple weeks before the surgery, she decided that she needed to set two things in order. One was her manuscript, getting it to a place where perhaps someone else could finish it in some form. The other was letters of recommendation. In that time of great stress, she wrote new ones for her current students, updated old ones for former students. I've thought about this a lot over the past few years, and I think what touched me in this gesture, and her desire, or maybe need, to spend precious time writing letters, involved her recognition and understanding of her role, what had to happen behind the scenes in order for everything else, for everyone else, to run smoothly. She really was a teacher. It's hard to imagine taking the obligations of teaching more seriously, yet so easy to see Miriam in this action. I said earlier that it was easy to become her student. It was also easy to become her friend, though much harder to recognize that you were. I think the difficulty in part revolved around the extent to which the line between student and friend could be blurred on her end. The sense of obligation she felt towards students was equally the kind of care she extended towards friends. It was basic, it was intense, and it mattered. And there was always the question that I had, and I think others had too, what would such an interesting person want with me? Conversations with Miriam seemed to carry with them implicit demands, to prove oneself worthy of being a friend, to have things to say about the topics she cared about, and to care about things she would find interesting. It felt like a lot to demand. It was. It was also worth it. There was also the humor, the irony, all coupled with the serious work. And looking back over the emails we exchanged, I came across two forwarded messages she sent within days of each other. The first was an announcement of a symposium on film and philosophy, to which he appended the following note. Is there any philosophy outside Wittgenstein and Deleuze? And doesn't the end of cinema as we know it reframe the conditions, necessity, chance for theorizing? The second was from a Christian dating service, with the heading, Looking for Christian Singles with Christian Principles. And Miriam had remarked, how about one for lapsed or double Christians? I also remember seeing movies with her, or rather seeing them through her eyes, since sitting next to her meant that there was going to be a range of whispered interjections that would form part of that experience. These comments, appreciative, critical, interested, track the shifts within the film, and were already becoming early theories about the film, or about what the film was showing. To watch a movie with her was to be present as she actively engaged in working through and coming to terms with what she was seeing. In all these things, and in all that everyone has said today, what I remember most is the sense of open-ended conversation, friendship, and learning. Now this open line feels artificially closed, ended before it was ready. It's a gap in my life, a loss for all of us. And sharing these memories and conversations reminds me how much better my life is for having been her student and her friend.
Years ago, a friend told me about having been invited through a happy accident to a lunch with Doris Lessing, at which Lessing had recounted the following personal story. In the course of waiting for a bus, she had become painfully conscious of being attracted to a young working-class guy whom she had only seen from a distance. Disturbed by the intensity of her reaction, she contacted an analyst, a Jungian whom she had seen for many years, but not for some time. The analyst saw Lessing at the appointed hour, heard her initial description of her turmoil at its full length, and replied, "You should know that I am preparing myself for death. Your problems don't interest me." I'm not sure I ever heard exactly what Lessing made of this encounter, but I've always explicated it to myself as an improbably salutary use of shame. The analyst never refused the call, never declined to make the appointment. Instead, she insisted on using her concentration on her own impending death to create a scale against which she measured Lessing's unease. She soothed astringently. The story of Lessing's analyst had always had a fierce charm for me until I met Miriam Hansen. Miriam had already been dangerously ill when I first met her. Physicians, nurses, and laboratories already had a firm grip on substantial portions of her calendar. She was very much aware that she had received a death sentence, though she didn't know exactly how long her reprieve would be. In the face of all this, she spoke matter-of-factly about her illness and never ginned up any Broadway musical-style defiance. Most remarkably, she, unlike the Jungian analyst, showed an uncommon degree of interest in the problems of others. Those problems included the sometimes unsteady opening thoughts of a dissertation student or a colleague struggling to find the right organization, the real first sentence. Those problems included the letters of recommendation solicited at the last possible moment by students who had just learned of an opportunity and its deadline. Those problems included dissertation exams that Miriam participated in by conference calls when she couldn't attend the exams in person. And those problems were deeply continuous with Miriam's sense of the untimeliness and importance of cinema to the social and political histories of the 20th century. Miriam combined devilish wit and great seriousness to forge the intellectual trajectory she traced out in the preface to her forthcoming book on the work of Krakauer, Benjamin, Adorno, and Kluge. Someone else might have written that preface so as to center it around her personal experience of having switched countries, languages, and fields. Miriam, however, talked about the development of her interest in cinema, and especially early cinema, in much the same way that she greeted the problems of those of us who worked with her. She hailed them and spoke for their importance so as to recognize them at their full worth, or rather to give them a worth they wouldn't have had without her attention. She worked to expose the living thought in the untimeliness of cinema, just as she vivified the preliminary drafts and hesitations of all her interlocutors and made thought live. She burnished everything she looked upon. She was, as another friend has said, a force for great good.
I first met Miriam at Rutgers University, where we were both teaching. That was in the early 1980s, and for me, it was love at first sight. This dainty, very strong-willed, enormously rigorous, intellectually vibrant person. She also lived in my neighborhood in New York, and we also sometimes commuted together. She had some sort of European car. I remember it as sort of a greenish brown, and I had an old Volkswagen Beetle, and we used to then go out together speaking in intoxicated ways about life and even love. We weren't yet married, not to each other and not to others at that time. There was also a lot of carbon monoxide, I think, in those cars. They were very, very broken down. The stories about the meeting of Michael and Miriam, well, rather apocryphal. I was convinced for many years that I had introduced them. That is, I had seen Michael at the Institute for Advanced Study in the late 1980s and was very taken by him, and especially about the relationship of him and women. I think they were rather formidable women. He was with Joan Scott, Itzy Hull. And when Miriam was going to go to Chicago, I was convinced that something was going to happen. Well, as it turned out, apparently I wasn't the only one. I think I remember Tina Grossman claiming that she had introduced them, and I think Itzy Hull claimed that, and probably there are people here who claim as well. All I can say, it was a great love story. We were very, very happy, her friends, and she grew immeasurably, partly her responsibilities, but I think also because of her personal happiness. At a certain point after Miriam left, and also because I was very close also to Michael and his work, I concocted a scheme for them to come to Columbia. It was going to be this great sort of movement of two people I was very devoted to. That was around 2000 for things having to do with difficulties of Columbia. It didn't come to pass, and soon thereafter, we learned that Miriam was very ill. And I remember the one thing I always said to myself as a kind of comfort was, thank goodness they stayed at Chicago, because the sense was that the University of Chicago and her colleagues and friends here helped in every way, that if she'd gone to New York, I know this sounds very personal and in some ways very pusillanimous, that school, Columbia, would never have been able to give the kind of support, the loving community support that was given to her and to Michael. Now, Miriam, as you know, had many fabulous qualities, and I think probably the first one that I would recognize here is her capacity for friendship. Speaking with her, talking with her, writing with her, it was a sort of a constellation. It was populated with names whom I knew as names, but there was a richness about them. And so Bill, the Gossets, George and Ron, Mona and Rashid, well before I met them, Andreas, Harold, these people were friends, but I found that several of them became friends of mine as well, so that after Miriam died on Saturday, we called around and we had a little wake for her, at Mona and Rashid's house in New York. There's also the extraordinary rigor, which was also this enormous engagement, which was so much, in some ways, a part of our generation, but it was something bigger. There was no, sort of conventional materialism, Marxist materialism. It was something bigger. It was Miriam's effort always to get behind things, and it showed in this remarkable work in some ways which is not cultural history, not intellectual history, something much, much deeper, something so deep and philological that in her recent work especially, better and better, she was able to render not just the ideas of her Frankfurt School people, they were not even part of a school anymore, but part of the society, but also to give a very profound sense of the modern of Europe of the mid and 20th century. Okay, beyond that, there was that question of clothing. I think that in 2007, I found a little note from Miriam from 2007, and she was saying that she just had chemotherapy and it was very, very hard. However, she was preparing to go to Turin to be present at a reception for her book, translated into Italian, Babel and Babylon, and now she had to think about what she was to wear. She says, Michael recommends that I wear a suit and flat shoes and a blouse. And she says, don't you think blouses are passé? And I wrote back and I said, yeah, I think pants on you are much sexier unless you decide to wear a skirt with patterned stockings and bootlets. I don't know what she wore, but she also had some vices, which I think were rather easily pardoned. One, she clearly didn't tolerate fools. I think the word beneath contempt, Miriam gave a new meaning to that. She didn't talk about those people that she didn't tolerate. She, for me, was a great sensualist around food, but an interminably, I shall say, slow eater and a slow food preparer. So for those of us who were quicker on our feet, Mediterranean, this was always a challenge. And this was carried over into the search for perfection. And I can remember summer, a couple of weeks, spending time with him in Michigan, and the perennial search for the perfect blueberry, which took us for hours around the streets of Michigan until finally I said, coming back home, exhausted, Miriam, perfectly fine, Miriam, why don't you just put some lemon on them? And Miriam, beneath contempt. Okay, that's our Miriam, I think Michael would say. Just an extraordinary person. I knew her some before she was sick, actually 15 years. And so in some ways, the illness was part of a longer history. It was, yes, it was terrible, it was bad, but this was something that she could clearly deal with, to the point when this last summer I wrote to her, I guess I hadn't been writing some, and I said to her, you know, Miriam, I'm mad at you for not being able to come out and play. And afterward I said, God, how petulant, how selfish, how could I have written that? And Miriam in her wisdom said, I'm very mad at myself too, because it's so beautiful outside.
Michael asked me to read a few poems to close this gathering. Miriam began as a student of poetry, and she returned to it often. One Thanksgiving 10 years ago, she read aloud to us Mark Doty's description, an evocation of the dazzled horizontals of light on a salt marsh on Cape Cod and the glowing colors of jewelry displayed at a Provincetown market. Doty wrote the poem while his partner was dying. It's an extended survey of the lush grammar of color and light, what he calls a vast conjugation of the verb to shine. Here are its closing lines. Jewelry, tides, language, things that shine. What is description, after all, but encoded desire? And if we say the marsh, if we forge terms for it, then isn't it contained in us a little, the brightness? A few years ago in this chapel, some of you may remember, Debbie Nelson read this poem again, remembering another much-loved colleague and a friend of Miriam's, Michael Camille. But in her last days in the hospital, Miriam asked Michael to read Wordsworth aloud to her. Things moved more quickly than they imagined, and it didn't happen. What might she have wanted to hear? Music was an important part of Miriam's life, as of course was walking in the woods or along the lake or seashore. So perhaps she thought of Wordsworth's encounter on a long walk in Scotland with the strange expressiveness of song in a language he couldn't understand. The poem's called The Solitary Reaper. Behold her single in the field, yon solitary Highland lass, reaping and singing by herself, stop here or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. I'm leaving out one stanza here. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far-off things and battles long ago. Or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today, some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again? Whate'er the theme, the maiden sang as if her song could have no ending. I saw her singing at her work and o'er the sickle bending. I listened, motionless and still. And as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. As some of you may recall, sometime after her diagnosis, with typical Miriam determination, she auditioned for and joined the university chorus. That was a year of much delighted playing and singing, and another ambition fulfilled. But when she had to stop walking and singing, but not thinking, she may have listened for these lines, the last I'll read, from the close of Wordsworth's great ode. And if she didn't hear them, we may now. Then sing, ye birds, sing, sing a joyous song, and let the young lambs bound as to the tabor's sound. We in thought will join your throng, ye that pipe and ye that play, ye that through your hearts today feel the gladness of the May. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy which having been must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind.
Join me in the memory of Miriam. This is a quote. This was my plea to family and friends in a message that I sent out late in the evening on February 5th, the day of Miriam's death. This plea has yielded spectacular results. Initial response burst forth in somewhat shocked, somewhat odd, but altogether wonderfully playful recollections on Facebook about encounters with Miriam as teacher, as colleague, as friend, or simply as a reader of her essays and books. This first round of recollection carried over into obituaries in American and German print media, and into spoken contributions at Miriam's funeral service at KAM and the Shivas at our home, as well as in the present gathering for Miriam, in which the faculty of the University of Chicago honors one of its dead in an admirable tradition of commemoration. Tributes and academic assessments have entered the academic conference circuit and will no doubt continue in books and essays to come. The fact that Miriam herself will posthumously intervene in this process with her forthcoming book may be taken as an indication of who she was, is, and will be, and that is a formidable presence in her absence. Still, work on memory remains hard. I do not mean here the always fragmentary process of recollecting and remembrancing. We recollect things, surfaces, images, thoughts that have once been external to us, and we try to store and retrieve them in our feeble minds with varying success. However, work on memory must perforce do the opposite: explicate, make visible, articulate, and painfully place in an external archive of texts, images, and the like what had been often unspoken, invisible, and entirely intimate bonds, such as gestures of endearment, to togetherness at an evening dinner, or conversations among friends. Memory work extricates what comes from within you and is part of you. It disincorporates. This work of memory, even the mere foreknowledge that it will happen and must happen, has brought many of us to tears. These are tears of grief in the face of loss, but there are also tears in facing up to the inexorable negation of death. In order to preserve the memory of Miriam, we do have to let go of transfer those intangible bonds that had us so intimately linked to her. It is in this transfer her former life and her work can be and will be carried on and will be carried over to new shores. As an example, you may think of the labors of friendship to be continued, but now without the genius for friendship of Miriam. You may think of the gestures of endearment that brightened the day for so many of us, but now we have to come up with them ourselves. You may think of more mundane matters, such as the practice of close reading, red marking, and discussing students' papers. But now we have to do it ourselves and without her help. And you may, of course, think of the intellectual challenges that were cut short by her illness and death. Vernacular modernism is still quite a messy concept. The sensible and sensitive treatise on Max Ophuls and on Miriam's favorite, The Earrings of Madame de, has yet to be written. Thought on cinema and post-cinema in a digital age will now have to do without her intervention. By engaging in the work on memory, we will be able to carry over Miriam's many past presences into our futures. The more delicate and sensuous transposition of intimate ties is part and parcel of this more worldly work of memory. Now, much has been written about grief lately, And grief is undoubtedly the most profound emotion in the face of death. However, it is also only one emotion among others. After hearing all these stories about her exploits today and at other times, I would surely want to add amazement, sheer amazement, to the register of emotions that comes with death. Who would have ever thought that Miriam dreamt of our cat Isabella being a telephone, as she confided to Dong Xin-ju. Now, I would like to have a word with her about the dreaming on that I wanted to replace that cat and she wanted to replace the telephone. And as a good Catholic, I know that I will have that chance, but let's leave this for the future. In any case, the dream made explicit not only the surrealist streak, but also the very practical mind of Miriam. Miriam was a woman who delivered practical solutions even in her dreams. Practical solutions in Kafkaesque environments, which incidentally explains why she was such a tough and successful infighter in university politics. Now, gratitude as another emotion brought out by memory is certainly a quality and an emotion we should not forget. And what I have in mind here is less my gratitude to Miriam for being with me and loving me for nearly 20 years, although that as well, but gratitude to everyone who has been with us over these years, and especially over the past 13 years of illness. Both of us, immigrants, both of us, depended on our elective families here in Chicago and in the United States. Neither of us could have had the good life we had without friends, comrades, and acquaintances. Among her records, I found a manila folder entitled Lymphoma Notes from 1998-99, which bear ample testimony both to deep and mere casual connections, solidarity, to use the old 20th century word, that sustained her and sustained us. What I have learned over the past few weeks since Miriam's death is just how dependent the happiness of our small family was on the colleagueship, the friendship, and indeed love of so many. Among her files, I also found the record of her medical bills since February 1998. And without wanting to trouble you with the business of historians about actuary tables, probability theory, and the history of it, and the history of benevolence, without doing any of that, it emerged very clearly from these records that without a multitude of healthy contributors, we would not only have faced ruin, but in fact would not have been able to pay for Miriam's treatment. And this already 2 years and a transplant with uncertain after 2 years and a transplant with uncertain outcome. If Miriam survived for so long, it had not least to do with all the good people who paid in her stead in the expectation that their treatment would be paid for when the need arises. This kind of security is the foundation on which modern community is built. And since I'm talking about simple and enlightened truths here, let me add another one. Much as we all admired Miriam's courage and fortitude in facing her many cancers, and much as her will to live, and I should add the readiness to change her habits to that end, was an indubitable asset in her struggle with cancer. The idea proffered in so many books of a triumph of the will, as we called it, in fighting cancer, is not only callous with regard to all those who succumb to their illness, but it is also wrong in our experience. It is the freedom of medical research, conventional and unconventional, and it's the ability of medical doctors to translate this knowledge into clinical practice that keeps patients alive and that kept Miriam among us for so long. Throughout her illness, Miriam was enabled to be the strong woman that she was by exceptional medical doctors and by caring nurses and capable technicians. They were our lifeline for 13 years, and while the rest was not exactly play, their work was the condition for our good life. Miriam could be her sparkling, twinkling, brilliant self because of the friendship and because of the care of others. As grief mingles with amazement and gratitude, we continue the funeral procession that began at KAM Isaiah Israel and will end with the interment of Miriam's remains in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague on May 8 this year. We will persist in the work on memory, which, so I hope, will be as communal and as sharing as Miriam's life, and for that reason will have some of her shine. Thank you for joining me in the memory of Miriam.